All right, so when it comes to approaching China and Chinese culture, you have to be very, very open-minded. It's very different, and it's going to be very, very different from what you're used to. If you grew up in the United States or anywhere Western, ideas and concepts of life and how things really are very different. And I remember when I started out learning about China, I was very young. My mom had been to China when she was a young girl, and she loved China. So she would talk about it all the time, and she would read books, and she would have us read books about it too. And it's very different from America. And the very first thing that you want to remember always is that we're all children of God. He loves us all equally, despite our differences. And when you are learning about Chinese culture, or when you're learning the language, you need to keep your personal ideas and the ways that you were taught and how you were brought up in its own little box. And you need to keep it there. And when you're introduced to a new concept from Chinese culture, my favorite thing to do, doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it this way, but my favorite thing to do is to find everything out I can about this culture, this tradition. And before I decide that it's either not okay or too different for me to accept or goes against what I believe, I try to learn everything I can about it so that I can make a proper judgment. But at the same time, there are going to be things that are so different that it's going to be hard for you to ever accept it. But I like to think that the reason they're different is because God made them that way. They're different. And we're not supposed to stay away from it or keep it for them, but we're supposed to learn from it. And there are so many beautiful things in Chinese culture that I've adopted into my life because I'm a seeker of truth, and truth seekers look for the good, the true, and the beautiful in everything. And I remember when I was studying more in depth into China, and one of the questions that always comes up with members of the church or anywhere about China is, especially in the church, is why aren't there missionaries in China? And when will we have missionaries in China? Or will we ever have missionaries in China? And simply, one of the most powerful things that I've ever heard about China and missionaries in China is from Dallin H. Oaks, and he said that it's not necessarily that China's not ready for missionaries, but we're not ready for them. And I think what I think he meant by that is that we as a culture are not ready or prepared to accept them as a culture, and to realize that the gospel, though its practices and principles will not change, the doctrines won't change, but perhaps the way that it is thought about and the way that it is carried out will be slightly different. And I think it's really important to recognize that the principles and the doctrines will stay the same, but they will probably be understood and carried out differently than how we are used to. So as for learning the language, I used to teach at the MTC, and the number one thing that missionaries would always ask me is why do they say it that way? And sometimes that's a good question. Like, sometimes there's a backstory behind this phrase or this common saying, and we tell the story, and it's this beautiful cultural experience. But sometimes it's just like, you know what? I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows why why Chinese say it this way. And so what I would tell the missionaries is you know what? Just forget about your English, take your English and throw it away, because English and Chinese are going to be different. And so you shouldn't compare English to Chinese or Chinese to English when you're learning it. In the beginning, you will be learning how to say hello, ni hao. And you always know that ni hao means hello in English. But literally, there are so many things in Chinese that don't exist at all in English. And you'll learn that with time. You'll learn that with experience. Those words will gain meaning when you use them and when other people use them around you. And so I think that's the best advice that I could give anyone learning Chinese, is just to accept Chinese for what it is and to take it as it is and to learn it just like a Chinese child would. Little by little, every day, gaining understanding, learning how it's used in certain contexts. So that is my advice for learning about Chinese culture, learning to love it, learning to love the people and who they are, and learning to communicate with them in such a way that would be Christ-like and full of love and charity.